What's up, everybody? So in this video, we're going to be talking about water, everything that you need to know about water. So let's just get straight into this. Now, when I ask you, where is water? What do you think of? Most people think habitats. So they think, the ocean, my pool, the dam, the river, right? Most people immediately think of this one. But in fact, there are so many other places where you can find water. Water is everywhere. Now, for example, let's think about a person. Let's think about Elon Musk. When we look at Elon Musk, we know, just like every person, he is made up of billions of cells, right? Maybe you don't know what cells is, don't worry, that's for another day, another video. But for now, a cell is basically the smallest thing we're made of. We're made up of billions of these tiny little things, these cells. Um, Now, cells are made up of mostly water. That's why we are mostly water. Maybe you've heard before. Humans or living things are like 70% water. And you'd be like, damn, how is that even possible? How are we 70% water? We're 70% water because we're made up of cells, and cells are 70% water. They're mostly water. Hence, we are mostly water. Okay. But how are cells mostly water? Like I said, you'll learn about cells later, but for now, we gotta just mention a few things. A cell is a little unit like this, and it's got a lot of these little factories. These factories do different things, and when they all work together, the cell survives, okay, and hence we survive. Now, these little factories are called organelles. Each factory has a different job. Now, organelles contain mostly water, okay? Now, what else? Outside of these factories, there's this little light blue color thing here. This is called cytoplasm, okay, and a bunch of reactions and things happen there, and guess what? It's basically just water. Now, okay, so now we know that habitat has water. Um, we are mostly water because our cells are mostly water. Okay, but what else? In between cells, there's just water. Okay, so we got we got water in between our cells as well. And then one last place is this. What happens when you get cut with a knife? Unless you're Superman, you're gonna bleed, right? And blood comes from where? It comes from your blood vessels. Blood, guess what, is mostly water. Okay, so we also have water inside our blood and our pee, so our body fluids, like our pee, our poo, our vomit, everywhere. So we got we got water in many places. Okay, so now that we understand water is everywhere, not just the ocean, we need to learn a little bit about water itself. Okay, and you're not gonna if you don't like chemistry, you're not gonna like this too much, but because it's biology, you don't need to know much detail, so we're just gonna cover a tad bit. Okay, you need to know a little bit about the structure of water, but not so much detail because this is not chemistry, it's biology. But if you do chemistry, you'll see much more of this. So when you think of water, you maybe have heard of H2O, right? H2O is what some people like to call water. Why did they like to call it H2O? Guess why? So the reason why is because the water structure looks like this. Okay, we got water is made up of an oxygen and two hydrogens. The oxygen binds to two hydrogens. So one oxygen binds to one hydrogen and then also binds to another hydrogen. Okay, damn, this is already crazy. What do we call this bond? This bond is called a covalent bond. Okay, this bond here. It's a very strong bond. Like it's almost impossible to break this bond. Now, you don't need to know more about this covalent bond because that's a chemistry thing, like I said. So just remember the bond that holds together the oxygen and the hydrogen is called a covalent bond. Okay, it's a bond is a kind of attraction. It's like when you hold someone's hand and you hold tightly. Even if people try and pull you apart, you're gonna still stick together. So it's the same thing here. There's this kind of bond, this kind of force keeping these two together that we call a covalent bond. Okay, great. So that's the basic thing. Also, I didn't draw it in this way for no reason. Make sure that you keep it in a V shape. The oxygen on top or whatever, doesn't have to be, you can also rotate it, it doesn't matter, as long as it's in a V shape. As long as it's in this kind of shape. The oxygen bonded to the two hydrogens in a V shape. That's very important, but we'll talk about this very shortly more, okay? So don't think that this is not important. We're gonna add some more detail now, and trust me, you need to know this, okay? We're just learning the very basics of the water structure. Now, okay, great. So now we know where water is from, where we can find it, and we know the basic structure. So what happens if we put two water molecules next to each other? What happens? Let's look. So, yeah, let's look at that first. Okay, here. So when we put two, nah, wait, let's actually talk about this. So we just said, right? We just said water is everywhere. Water is everywhere, right? So how did water come to Earth in the first place, right? Because we know for life to exist, that's why when people try and find planets to survive on, like Mars and the moon and whatever, they always look for planets that have some water on them because water is necessary for life to exist. So how did water come to Earth in the first place? So a very long time ago, the Earth was just a rock of boiling lava. It was magma, just a rock that is just boiling, okay? It's just like molten lava. Then over time, so obviously if you put water on this kind of planet, will it stay there? No way. It instantly evaporates, right? So over time, over a long period of time, cooling happened. So cooling, right? So the Earth started getting slowly over many, many years, getting colder and colder because the lava started getting less and less. And after a very long time, the Earth was cool enough to retain water. So it got to a point where you could put water on the Earth and it would stay there. Okay, so after a very long time, this is very simplified, obviously, because you don't need to know that many details. But after a long time of cooling, the Earth managed to keep some water. Now, water is important because it is necessary for life. So because water managed to exist, cells managed to exist. Because cells manage to exist, we manage to exist because organisms are all made up of cells. So that's the basic idea you need to know. Now let's go back to the structure of water. So remember, water is the structure. We got an oxygen bonded to two hydrogens. So now I want to go even more detailed. You need to know this though. So here we have a cool diagram, which I think explains it well. We got here an oxygen binding to a hydrogen. So this is the hydrogen pulling, and this is the oxygen pulling, okay? They're trying to pull, and I'll explain what this means. So right here, we're only having one oxygen bonded to a hydrogen, even though the real structure has oxygen to hydrogen and oxygen to hydrogen. Because if you understand one of these interactions, the other one is exactly the same. So let's just look at one. So what happens is, I'm going to simplify this because in chemistry you learned the real, more detailed stuff. So I'm going to give you a nice example to help you remember this. But basically, what happens is in between oxygen and hydrogen, there's electrons, okay? Electrons. Electrons are very negatively charged molecules. They're very negative, okay? So you can have positive molecules and negative molecules, negative things. Electrons are negative. Now, basically, oxygen and hydrogen both like these electrons. They want them. They want this negativity in their life. It's like they're not happy. I mean, they're too happy. They want some negativity. So they pull on this electrons. But just like humans, like your friend, you or your friend is stronger. You're not both the exact same strength, right? So just like this, oxygen is pretty strong. We can give it a number, 3.44, let's say. And then we can give hydrogen a strength number of 2.20. You don't need to remember these numbers. It's just to get this concept out of the way. So guess what happens? If oxygen is stronger than hydrogen, which one is going to have more electrons? Oxygen, right? It may not have all of them, but it's going to have more. So the electrons will lean more towards oxygen. It is stronger at attracting these electrons. So what will that mean? That will mean oxygen is going to be what? More or less? Which one will be more negative? Oxygen or hydrogen? Oxygen, because oxygen is pulling more of these negative charges towards it, meaning we can classify oxygen as more negative. So because it's not completely negative, it's not going to take all of the electrons. It's only going to take slightly more than hydrogen. Because of this, it's not completely negative, it is only slightly negative. So we're going to call it delta negative. This is just a way of saying it is slightly negative, slight negative, not completely. Now, on the contrary, hydrogen is pulling on electrons and it's getting some, but not as much as oxygen. So we're going to call it slightly positive because it loses more electrons than it's gaining. So we call it, when you lose negative things, you are yourself more positive, right? So it's going to be, it makes sense because like, think about life. If you lose negativity in your life, some negative person, you're going to be more positive, okay? So it's the same thing here. Now next, so that's how this one attraction looks like. So if we have then a water molecule, we have one here. The oxygen is therefore negatively charged because they're pulling on these electrons better. They're negatively charged. The hydrogens will be positively charged. So when you put two water molecules next to each other, we know from school that positive and negative charges attract. So a positive charge will attract this negative charge, right? It's like magnets. So when you put these water molecules together, they will attract. The positive hydrogen will attract this negative oxygen. Okay, so what do we call this kind of attraction, this kind of bond? Because it's basically a bond. We know this one here was called a covalent bond. Now, the covalent bond was very strong. This one here is relatively weak and temporary. So when a bond is temporary, we call it an ephemeral attraction. Ephemeral just means temporary, so it's not going to be there permanently. It will form and break and form and break. So think about like water flowing. When water flows in the ocean, these bonds are forming and breaking. So that because if they were stuck like this, water would be solid, right? But because they are relatively weak, they can break and form, and that can cause water to flow, right? So it's an ephemeral attraction. It's a temporary. Ephemeral just basically means temporary. So it forms and goes and forms and goes. So let's put another one, another water molecule here. What's going to happen here? Of course, this negative oxygen will attract to this positive hydrogen. Now, remember how I said this bond here is the covalent bond. This one here is a hydrogen bond. So these are the two bonds you're going to need to know about. The two bonds. Now, I always find it like in the beginning, I found it very difficult to remember which one is now a covalent bond and which one was a hydrogen bond. Like I always found it so tricky. So I found a nice way that can help you out a little bit if you are there in the test and getting a brain fart. Basically, the hydrogen bond, remember I said it's the weaker one. It's the ephemeral attraction. Okay, it's the weaker bond. It is, I like to remember it as hydrogen bonds are hiding. That's why I made a striped line, like a dashed line, because they're not as strong. They're hiding. These bonds are there, but they're also not there. Like they're not as strong. So hydrogen bonds are hiding. They are weaker than the covalent bonds. Okay, so that's how you remember it. If you don't remember if this one was the hydrogen or covalent bond, just remember the hydrogen bonds are hiding. So they're the ones in between the water molecules. Okay, now another key word you need to know is polar. This will be easy if you do chemistry, but if you're a bio student, then let's try and get this down. What does polar mean? So if you're a polar person, you're known to be very emotional. 1 second you're positive, 1 second you're negative, 1 second you're happy, and then you're moody. So same thing here. This is polar. So one side is negative and one side is positive. So this is a polar molecule. So a polar molecule is just one that has one side positive and one side negative. Okay? So it's polar. A non-polar molecule would just be one that doesn't have a clear positive side and doesn't have a clear negative side. Okay, it's non-polar. Now, let's try and make this more realistic here. Let's put a glass of water. Okay, glass of water. So when you see a glass of water and you zoom in very, very far with a microscope or something, so maybe an electron microscope, whatever, something that can zoom really far, you will see these molecules and you'll see these attractions. What do we call these attractions again? Hydrogen bonds, right? Hydrogen bonds. Now, you can imagine these are little bonds. So if you put something here, unless they break this bond, they will float on the water, right? So that's kind of interesting here. So some small organisms can kind of walk on water if they are light enough, because they won't break these bonds, so they won't sink into the water, okay? We'll talk more about this later. So overall, what do we know now? We know now water is everywhere. It's everywhere, right? Nature everywhere. We know the structure. We know why water came to Earth, okay? And now we know a little bit about the structure of water. You need to know how to draw this, and you'll see later there's an IB question that asks you to draw this, okay? If you can draw this, you got it. We'll look at it at the end of the video. Okay, so that's what we know now. I just mentioned that water is polar, right? Water is polar. So I want to give you an example of a non-polar molecule. You don't need to know this. I'm just showing it for clarity, just so you understand. So if we use the same concept, we assign this molecule, it's got carbon and 4 hydrogens. Each carbon is bound to 4 hydrogens. Then we can say this. By the way, carbon always binds to 4 hydrogens, okay? But we'll learn about this later. So carbon always has 4 bonds, okay? But don't worry about this now. So if we assign it, again, they battle for these electrons and we assign them numbers. But notice how carbon and hydrogen has very similar strengths, okay? They train together. They train at the same gym, okay? So they got the same strengths. So what happens is the electrons kind of stay in the middle. So carbon and hydrogen, they both stay neutral. So this is a non-polar molecule. There's no charges, okay? It's all neutral. So this is a non-polar molecule, which means if you put them next to each other, they don't have such a strong bond to each other. Let me show you. So if we put two of these molecules next to each other, because there's no charges, they don't form this kind of hydrogen bond. Okay, they don't form this bond. This doesn't happen. So they don't stick. They're basically easier to be gases because they have no interaction with each other, nothing keeping them together so strongly. So they are more likely to be gases. Okay. Okay, so if you understand all this, this is the very important key things you need to understand. We're now going to talk about some things about water, okay? Some properties. So water has adhesion properties, it has cohesion properties, it has solvent properties, and it has physical properties. This sounds like a lot, but trust me, if you understood well what was going on so far in this video, this should be fairly simple and easy to understand. But you need to know these things. Okay, let's get into them. So cohesion and adhesion. In simple terms, break down the word. Co means each other, and adhesion means sticking, basically. So if you think about it, cooperation, that means working together, right? The word co is there, it means each other. So cohesion means sticking to each other. So cohesion is when water molecules stick to each other. So when we looked at this, when we looked at the cup, this was cohesion. The water molecules are sticking to each other. This property of water is called cohesion. Now, why is cohesion important? Okay, cohesion is useful for many ways. Firstly, I already mentioned, it allows certain organisms to be able to live on water, okay? Because this water, these interactions need to be broken before this organism can fall in. And if they're light enough, they won't break these bonds. So that's important. Okay. So here's the official definition. It's just when molecules of the same type attract to each other. So regarding water, it's when water molecules attract to each other. And remember, let me quiz you again while we're at it. What do we call these bonds? Hydrogen bonds. Okay, good. Okay, let's look at this. So here's the same, it's just another picture of the same concept. It's this lizard running on water. And it's because of surface tension. So this, let me bring this back. When these bonds happen, it creates this tension. It creates this force that doesn't allow something to quickly step through it. Okay, they first have to break this bond. This is called surface tension. So water has pretty good surface tension, pretty high surface tension, which allows organisms to like live on it. Now, another cool example is this one. You can try this. When you have a coin and you drip drop by drop, how many drops do you think you can put? It will surprise you because of cohesion, it forms this dome shape. Normally, you would expect this dome the water to just fall off the coin when it gets too much, but the water sticks together, right? Cohesion, they stick together, so they end up forming this dome shape instead of falling off because this water has an attraction to itself. So this dome shape ends up forming. You can try it. This is cohesion. Now let's go to adhesion. So adhesion is the opposite. It's when molecules attract to other molecules. So adhesion would be when water attracts to another kind of molecule. So let's say here we have water. Here's another molecule. That's adhesion. This hydrogen bonding of water to another molecule. That's adhesion. So if we look at this example here of a leaf and a water molecule, a water drop, this water drop obviously has many, many water molecules in it. Because of this adhesion, the water sticks and it doesn't fall off so easily. This is called adhesion. So this here, cohesion, adhesion. Ad means to something else. Co means to itself. Okay? So cohesion and adhesion means sticking. So sticking to itself, sticking to other things. Now, why is there an example of where both of these are used together? Let's see. So we're going to use the example of plants. Okay, so this is soil here. This is a plant and its roots. And we know plants take up water through the roots, right? And the specific pipe that does that is called a xylem, but you don't need to worry about this now. Just know there's a pipe that brings up water, right? Because plants need water and nutrients to feed the leaves and the fruits and all that, right? So, because they don't have a mouth to drink water, so they need to bring water somehow. Now, the method with which they bring up water is called capillary action, okay? And capillary action uses adhesion and cohesion properties of water. Let me show you how it works. We're gonna just briefly run over this. Okay, let's open this big brain box. So here we got some straws and we got a pool. When you stick a straw into the pool and you suck water out of it, how does it work? Like this. Very simply, this is how it works. First, when you suck, what do you remove? For the first split second, you remove air, right? When you remove air, you create negative pressure. inside the straw. What does that mean? Okay, positive pressure is this. You take a water bottle, you blow air into it as hard as you can. You're creating pressure inside, and that causes the water bottle to expand, okay? Because that's positive pressure. You're putting pressure inside the water. You're putting air pressure inside the water bottle. Negative pressure is the opposite. When you suck air out, you remove all of the air. So what you're doing is by removing all of the air, now you're pulling on the side of the bottle and you're causing it to pull inwards, collapsing the water bottle, okay? So when you remove the air, now you create this negative pressure. This negative pressure means there's no more air inside. And so what you're doing now is you're pulling on the wall of the straw or the wall of whatever you're sucking out of. You're trying to pull this wall inwards because there's no more air to pull out. So now it has to pull on this wall, or it has to pull from down here. So if the wall of the straw is very strong, let's say it's like made of bamboo, then the straw isn't going to shut closed. But if the straw is very plastic, very weak, then if you suck really hard, the straw will shut closed and you won't be able to get water up, right? The same with the bottle. When you suck out a lot of air and the water bottle is plastic, you're going to collapse it. If it's metal, you're not going to collapse it because the wall is much stronger. Now, you're basically dragging this wall in, but if the wall is strong, it will stay like that. It's fine. It won't collapse. And then the other spot where you're sucking from is from the bottom of the straw because you'll put pressure on the walls, but you'll also try and bring water from the pool. Okay? So assuming that the straw is strong and you're sucking, and the straw is like a normal straw, it's a strong straw, then water will come up because you've now sucked out all the air. So now you're pulling on the water from the pool. Okay, so now the water will start going up. Why does the water go up? The water goes up because of the cohesion and adhesion property. Cohesion allows the water molecules to stick to each other. So when you suck the water up, they stay together. You form a column of water instead of just one drop here, one drop here. The water all come together because they like to stick to each other by cohesion. Additionally, the water likes to stick to the side of this wall. So if water didn't like to stick to the side of the straw, it wouldn't want to come up. So adhesion is also important. The water likes to stick to the side of the straw and to each other, and hence you can bring up water pretty easily when you drink from a straw. So if we understand this concept of a straw and the pool, then you'll understand this one very well. It's the same thing. So basically, if we imagine this right here is the xylem, or the thing sucking up the water from the roots, you can imagine that it brings up the water, right, through the same property. So since you understood the previous slide, this one will be easier. So adhesion is the water sticking to the side, and cohesion is water sticking to itself, right? That's here. Notice, interestingly, how it forms a meniscus, a V shape. That's because at this region of the straw, the adhesion is bigger than the cohesion. So the water sticks better to the side of the straw than it does to itself. And so it forms this V shape, okay? Other materials, so like if it's not water, so let's say mercury, then it doesn't work because mercury doesn't have hydrogen bonding. It's not the same. That's why water is so special, right? So imagine if there was no water, these plants wouldn't be able to bring up anything to drink, okay? Because other materials don't work the same. Okay. Last thing here is what causes the water to want to come up? Remember how when you were drinking, you suck out air. So, and then this causes the water to want to come up because negative pressure is created. The same thing here. The plant sweats and it releases water and stuff out of this little pore. And you'll learn about this in another chapter. And this causes negative pressure to be created in the xylem, and this causes water to come up, okay? So again, this is capillary action. So now we covered these two, adhesion and cohesion, very important. So they can work individually and they can work together, right? We know what they mean, so let's move on to the next one, solvent property. So are you guys still surviving? There's a lot of information, but don't worry. It's like I'm trying to make it as simple and as clear as possible, and hopefully you only have to watch a video like this once and understand it. Because there's like few words that you'll need to like write down 10 times before you remember it, but hopefully the concepts make sense immediately. Okay, so let's go to the solvent property. So if I give you these 4 people and I asked you to match them, who is more likely to hang out? Who is more likely to be friends? So probably you're going to say the two sporty people and then the two nerdy geeky people. Yeah, that's right, right? That makes most sense. So this brings me to the idea of like dissolves like, or polar dissolves polar. What this means is things that are similar in polarity will bind together. So polar thing will dissolve polar thing. So water is polar. So water, things that are polar will very easily dissolve in water, whereas things that are non-polar will will have a very hard time dissolving in water. Same thing as these people. People that are alike will hang out together and people that are not alike will not. Okay, so let's look at this. Okay, so here we have the structure of water, right? Again, we know it's polar. Now, if we look at this again for the 10th time, we're looking at this glass of water, okay? And we try and dissolve something in it. Whether or not this thing will dissolve will depend on whether this thing is polar or not, whether it is hydrophilic or not. So if we take salt, like this is table salt. When you put salt into water, it will dissolve. If you stir for a while, it will dissolve and you won't see the salt anymore. So we call this kind of molecule hydrophilic. Hydro means water and philic means loving. So this kind of molecule is hydrophilic. It loves water, meaning when you put into water, it'll dissolve. So what does that look like? So because, notice, it's polar. Let's bring this. It's polar, right? So sodium is positive and chlorine is negative. So when you put it in water, the positive, remember the hydrogens, these whites, are positively charged. So the positively charged will interact with the negatively charged chlorine, and that way it will be dissolved. So it will not stay on the surface, it will actually go into the water and dissolve. On the contrary, the negatively charged oxygen will interact with the positively charged sodium and dissolve it. Okay, so very important. Hydrophilic molecules like this, like sodium chloride, will dissolve in water very well. On the contrary, there is hydrophobic molecules. These are things like fat. So if you try to put oil into water, you notice it forms this weird meshy thing. Like it doesn't want to dissolve. The oil and the water will separate into two separate compartments, right? If you haven't tried this, you should try it. This is because lipids is just, that's like an example. It's fat. Fat are lipids, science name for fats. They are hydrophobic. So hydro again means water and phobic means to fear. So they fear water in a sense because when you put them into water, they do not dissolve because they are non-polar, right? They don't have these charges that can interact with the water molecule to be able to dissolve. So that's important to understand. Most things are soluble in water. That's why water is known as the universal solvent. Very, very important. Okay, so let me just make sure about something. A good example to kind of illustrate this is this one. When you look at a leaf, right? A leaf has a top side and a bottom side. So here we got the top side and the bottom side, and we got the water inside, right? Now, water can normally leave a leaf pretty easily if it's a very warm day, right? So the leaf can lose a lot of water. But because of this, this one property, so the leaves can secrete a thing called a cuticle. Let me show you. It can secrete this thing called a cuticle, and this cuticle is, guess what? It is hydrophobic. What does that mean? That means when water tries to leave the leaf, it cannot, because it cannot dissolve in this thing and then leave. They repel each other. They are this cuticle layer is hydrophobic. It hates water. So when water tries to come near, it cannot pass, okay? So this is very important because this allows leaves to retain water so they don't get dehydrated. So this is just an example of where the solvent property also matters, okay, in terms of plants. Okay, so now we've covered adhesion, very easy, cohesion, we got it, and solvent. Basically, what you got to take away from solvent is that polar things will dissolve in water, like dissolves like, okay? So water will dissolve polar things, non-polar things like lipids will not dissolve, and it's because of the hydrogen bonding, right? Okay, last thing here, physical properties. Let's get this down. So there's a few physical properties that we've got to look at. We'll do it one by one, and it should make, there's a lot of like new words, but it should make sense because I have a nice diagram to help kind of illustrate it. Buoyancy. So what is buoyancy? Let's look at this. So water is pretty buoyant. What does that mean? So when you have you if you've ever gone to a pool or the ocean or whatever, and you put one of these balls, these beach balls, and you try and press it into the water, what happens? It instantly shoots out, right? You can press it as deep as possible and then it just shoots out. This is called buoyancy. So water is buoyant, meaning whatever you try and when you try and push something into water, if it's not very heavy, if it's not very dense, like this ball, it will push back onto the ball. It will press that out of the water. Okay, so that's one property that water has that is pretty interesting. Okay, buoyancy. If you like, an easy way to remember it is compare everything to air. Is air buoyant? No. If you press a ball into air, it's just gonna fall. It's gonna fall down to the bottom on the floor, right? Whereas you try and shove this ball into water, it's gonna shoot out. So water is very buoyant compared to air. So it's easy if you compare it to air. See here. So buoyancy, if we had to put it in fancy words, it's an upward force exerted on an object placed on a specific medium. All they're trying to say is it's when the object shoots out of the water when you press it into that material. Okay, the force. So we're only going to care about water. So this is like the general definition, but we're talking about it with respect to water. Okay, next. Viscosity. Okay, viscosity. So here, we're at the same place, the same beach place. If you've ever tried to dive into water, what happens? You hit the water and you slow down, right? You don't keep going through the water forever, right? But have you ever tried to jump off a hill? I hope not, but if you've done skydiving or something, you'll notice that you don't slow down unless you have a parachute. Okay, if you jump off a hill, you will reach the bottom for sure. Whereas if you jump into the ocean, even though the ocean is very deep, you're never going to reach the bottom. You'll maybe go 1 or 2 meters deep. Okay, so this property of water is viscosity. Okay, so different materials have different viscosity. So air's viscosity is very low because when you jump through air, it doesn't slow you down. Whereas if you jump into water, it slows you down. So viscosity is basically the ability of a medium like water or air or whatever it is to slow you down, to prevent you from going through it. Okay, so when this guy dives in the water, because water has viscosity, he won't hit the bottom of the floor so easily. Whereas if this was just air, he would definitely hit the bottom. Okay. Viscosity. So here let's put the resistance of a substance that a substance gives to an object moving through it. So it's just like resistance, okay? And so that's the second one. Let's look at the third physical property, specific heat, okay? So this one we can all probably relate to. Water, let's say it's a nice summer day and you go to the pool and you just notice, gosh, it's so hot outside, but this pool is cold, man. It's cold. I don't want to get in even though it's so hot. So this is actually a property of water. So let me give you a thing here. Dangisha. Wait a second. Okay, so if we pretend this is the pool and there's heat given off by the sun, what's going to happen is if it's hot enough, you can break these bonds. So look, remember these hydrogen bonds. Unless you break them, the water isn't going to evaporate. The water's temperature won't change. So if it's very hot, then you can slowly break these bonds, okay? And maybe heat up the water. Now imagine water didn't have these hydrogen bonds, how quickly it would heat up. Because all these things would just evaporate and become gas and become very warm. But because of hydrogen bonding, this process takes so long, which is why on a very hot day, evaporation is very slow. And so the water temperature changes very slow. So we call this specific heat. Specific heat is basically how much temperature a specific medium needs to heat up, okay, to heat up by 1 degree. So water has a high specific heat. It takes a lot. That's why it has to be 100 degrees before water actually boils, okay? Wait a second. Computer's going nuts. Okay. Okay, so But this one we can all relate to. On a very hot day, it takes ages for the water to heat up, even though it's super hot. That's just because water has a high specific heat. So let's put the definition here. So the specific heat is the amount of heat it requires to change the temperature of a substance. So water has a very high specific heat because it takes a lot of energy, a lot of heat to heat up water, okay? Now the last one, like for example, let's say there are other materials other than water that heats up very quickly. For example, this one, okay? Remember this one, this nonpolar molecule we looked at before. Because it has no hydrogen bonding, as soon as you apply heat, it heats up very quickly. It becomes gas very quickly. So it can actually boil at negative 161 degrees Celsius, whereas water can boil at 100 degrees Celsius. Okay, now last one here, the last property is this one. Thermal conductivity. Okay, so if you've ever sat in water, if you've ever gone to a pool, the pool is the same temperature everywhere. So if you touch the water of the pool on this side, it's going to be this. It's not like, oh, it's cold this side, let's go to that side because it'll be warm there. Water has very good thermal conductivity, which means when this area gets warm, it spreads and the whole rest of the area will be the same heat. Okay, so the thermal conductivity, the spreading of the temperature is very good. Whereas, for example, if you let's say this, if you heat up, if there's a heater this side, not only this side will be warm. After a while, the whole pool will be warm because the water. Hur I'm busy. So because of this fact that if you heat up this side, not only this area will be warm. The water has good conductivity, which means the heat will travel quickly and easily from this side to the other side, and the whole pool will soon be warm, right? Whereas air, let's think about air. If you make a fire on one end of a campsite, that doesn't mean that the people on the other end of the campsite will instantly get super hot, right? Air doesn't have such good thermal conductivity. The heat doesn't travel so well through air compared to as it does in water, okay? So those are the key physical properties of water, okay? Buoyancy, viscosity, specific heat, and thermal conductivity. Now, the last thing we need to know is you need to know about these two animals with regards to these specific properties. You need to know, okay? So we got the black-throated loon, which is like a duck, and we got the ringed seal, which is like a seal with rings on it. And you need to understand how these properties of water apply to these two organisms. So, for example, buoyancy. Buoyancy, what was that again? That was the force that water exerted upwards on anything going into the water. So water has good buoyancy, which means that these things can float pretty easily, right? So that's how water is useful to these organisms. It helps them float. What about viscosity? So viscosity actually makes life a bit difficult. Is running or swimming harder? Running is easier. Air doesn't have big viscosity, which means when you run, the air doesn't resist you. Whereas when you try and swim, you have to put so much more effort to move because the water has a lot more viscosity. So these organisms had to adapt to be able to overcome this problem of water, okay? So basically this duck has web-shaped feet, right? It's like flippers. And their body is streamlined so that the water doesn't, so they get less affected by the water. The same thing for this ringed seal. It has specific paddle feet, right? Allowing it to swim much better. So like humans, for example, are not very well adapted to swimming. Like we will struggle a lot with viscosity. We cannot travel fast. Now, specific heat. So remember how I just said water's temperature takes a long time to change. So it can be very hot outside, but the pool can be cold. Or it can be very, very cold outside, but the water may actually be warmer. You'll be surprised. Like it may be very cold outside, but you may actually feel better inside the water. Like you will go into water, and when you start getting out, you'll be like, ooh, that's cold. And you'll want to stay in the water. Okay, so it's the same thing here. These organisms live in very cold environments, like the Arctic, okay? And so even though it's freezing outside, like -50, they can survive in the water because the water is warmer than the outside, because the water takes a long time to get cold compared to the outside. So not only does the water take a long time to get warm when it's warm outside, it also takes a longer time to get cold when it's cold outside, okay? So that's useful. That's why water is actually useful for these organisms, because they can survive better in the water than outside because the water's a bit warmer. Okay, next one, thermal conductivity. Basically, when these organisms You know, when you're in water, you lose heat. If you stay in very cold water for long enough, you will lose heat and you'll like die, right? That's what happens with the Arctic. That's what happens in Titanic, right? Jack goes into water. He can't stay there forever. Eventually, he dies because he loses a lot of heat. So the problem is this: um, organisms like humans are not very well adapted. So when we go into water, we lose heat exceptionally fast and we will die very quickly. Why does this guy not die when there's a Titanic crash? Because he is adapted. He has a way of overcoming this problem that water has. Water very easily spreads, like I said. Remember, we talked about the pool. Water, if you heat up this area, water on this side will heat up. If you cool down this area, water on this side will cool down after a little bit of time. So the same thing here. If this organism is warm, the heat will very quickly go from this organism to the surrounding water, and the organism will get colder. So they have certain adaptations to prevent this thermal conductivity property that water has. For example, this guy here, he has this oil gland, okay, and he secretes oil. And remember, oil, all that is, it's a lipid, it's a fat. And remember this example here. This fat prevents water from exiting the leaf, right, the cuticle. So this animal has a similar kind of idea. It takes this oil, puts it on its fur or its feathers, and when it puts it on its feathers, now the water cannot leave. So the heat from the water cannot escape. The water cannot evaporate from its body, so it stays warmer. It gets stuck inside the body. Now, so that's how that one adapts, the black-throated loon. Now this one here, the ringed seal, it has a lot of fat. It's chunky. It's got some mass. Okay, it's chubby. So because of this, this blubber, they call it blubber. It's basically just fat under the skin. Again, fat, right? Fat and water don't mix. So the heat from the water inside your body cannot pass through the fat. So they retain the heat very well, and therefore they can survive a long time. This is cringing me a little bit. Wait, forgot the brackets. So because of this, they can survive much longer than humans because we do not have any of these cool properties to survive in cold temperatures. Okay, so that's it for everything you got to know about water. Now we just have I just want to give you some questions. So these, although this is a new syllabus, the questions, the content is pretty much the same, okay? So the IB questions will still apply. It will still be the exact same. It will still be useful. So I'm still going to give them to you, and you'll see it applies exactly to what we learned. I'll give you one multiple choice one and one long answer question. You can try and do these and see how you do. So here, which properties explain the ability of water to dissolve solutes? The polarity of water molecules, is that true? The high specific heat capacity of water, is that true? Hydrogen bonding, so you gotta find the right one. So let's look at this one. So what allows water to dissolve solutes? So if we go back to this one, is it polarity? Give me a sec, let me find it. Okay, here. So water is polar, right? And because it's polar, it can dissolve certain solutes, right? We explained, because this molecule is polar as well, so they can dissolve. So yeah, water's polarity is one reason. So that's true. Oh yeah, so solutes, by the way, is something that is dissolving in the water. You call that solute. So water is a solvent because it's dissolving something, and a solute is something going into the water to be dissolved. Okay, now we got this one, the high specific heat capacity of water. So we learned about the high specific heat. Is that related to its ability to dissolve something? No, right? That's another property of water. It's not related to dissolving anything. It's related to its heat ability. And hydrogen bonding, that's also true because hydrogen bonding is what makes it polar, right? So if we go back to this example, here we have this polar molecule and we have water, this polar molecule, and because of its hydrogen bonding, because of this polarity, its positive charge here can attract to this negative charge here, which is just hydrogen bonding. So the hydrogen bonding allows it to dissolve certain things. So the answer here would be 1 and 3, right? So it's going to be B. Okay. I told you this one would matter. Draw a labeled diagram showing the structure of water, 3 water molecules, and show how they interact. Here's the mark scheme, so you can take a look at this. But because there's no diagram, I'll show you the one I made. If you can draw this, you've nailed it. Okay? If you draw this, you've nailed it. Let me show you why. Because you have to show the V shape, like I explained. You have to have a line between the O and the H's and label it as a covalent bond. you have to have 3 water molecules and make the dotted lines in between the O and the H's, which is the hydrogen bonding. And you can have this slight negative charge and slight positive charge. And then, honestly, because there's 5 options here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you just have 4 of these, you'll get 4 marks. So you don't even need all of these, just have 4 of them. So that's it for this video. I hope everything makes sense on water. It's really a huge topic. I really encourage you to understand this as much as possible because it's going to help you a lot in other topics. Water is everywhere. It matters a lot. If you can understand these things, it'll be hugely beneficial.